Hey folks, in this video we're going to continue with our main ideas of chapter 2 from the text. And here we're going to talk about heritability. And heritability, the word sounds a lot like inherited, and that's for good reason. It comes from the same root. So here's the idea that some psychology is going to be inherited or passed down from generation to generation. And we're particularly interested in differences in genetics to the extent that our genes are different from one person to the next that might contribute to differences in psychology, behavior, or mental processes. So this is our definition, right? And while some topics in evolutionary biology are sometimes controversial, depending on who you talk to, the idea of heritability really isn't one of those, because we know that kids are similar to their parents and similar to their siblings, both in terms of appearance. You see the Bush family, Lenny Kravitz and Lisa Bonet and Zoe Kravitz and the Kelseys here. You see they look similar, but also personality wise, behavior wise, right? These guys grow beards and these guys don't. They've got the same haircut. That's behavioral choice. Personality wise, right? Whether you smile for a picture or you don't, the kinds of things that you engage in, your talents, like musical abilities, that sort of thing. A lot of these tend to run in families. Now, to some extent, that's because you learn it in your family. But just like your hairline might be passed down, a lot of our psychology might be passed down as well. And so, this is what we're talking about when we talk about heritability. And the question is, well, how does this work? So, how do I get my psychology from my parents? And of course, the basic answer is that it's genes, right? So, we know that we've got DNA, um, and on our DNA molecules, okay, we have these things called genes. Genes are sequences of DNA molecules, sequences of chemical bases on our DNA molecules located on chromosomes. Okay, so every cell's got a nucleus, and in the nucleus we've got chromosomes. On the chromosomes, are genes, right? This is basic stuff you learned in early biology, right? Humans are vastly similar in terms of the genes that we have. Lots of our genes do basically nothing, and lots of them do the same thing for me as they do for you, and the sequences are basically identical for a lot of our gene sequences. You know, but there are some differences, and where those differences exist, people who are related are more similar, and people who are not as related are less similar. This is, of course, how paternity tests work. I can tell who somebody's father is likely to be based on the similarities in their genes. You may know the term allele. Allele is the term that we use for different versions of genes. So there may be a gene, like a FOXP2 gene that might have this version and that version. Okay, these would be alleles of the FOXP2 gene. And the basic idea here is that genes are building blocks for development. So the genes are what we're going to use. We'll talk about this next time. The genes are what we're going to use to build biology for the development of the human body. So how do we end up getting these genes from our parents? And this is going to be review as well. Okay. So you've learned this in other biology classes. So we're going to do a quick review of chromosomes, genes, and replication. So as you probably know, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. That's called diploid. We got pairs too. Okay. So 23 chromosomes paired, 46. Okay. Um, I've got these pairs, and when we undergo meiosis, we split those pairs into gametes. Okay, some people produce eggs, some people produce sperm. Those are not paired; they just contain one of the two pairs of chromosomes. Okay, then when we engage in reproduction. The gametes combine, and so the haploid cells, the sperm and the egg, come together and they form a new diploid pair. So now they've got half from one contributor and half from the other. And so I've got a new zygote that's got chromosomes that are combined um, from the sperm and the egg. Okay. Now, why do we do this? Why don't we just copy ourselves? Why don't we just clone ourselves? Well, the idea here is to get that genetic diversity, so that not everybody's going to be the same. Because if there's a virus that harms some people more than others based on genetic differences, our species is more likely to survive if we have more diversity, or if there's a tendency that leads to cancer development that's based on genes, right? We'll have more diversity, so not everybody's going to end up developing that cancer. So we pair up like this for a reason. There's a function to it. Okay, so we're then going to get these genes in a new zygote, single-celled zygote that then is going to produce a new person in this case. Um, your lecture slides, if you're taking my class, have a longer video on this. If you want to go back through all the details, we're not going to go through the steps of meiosis in this class. That's for your bio class. It's a little too cellular for us. Okay. The question for us is, if we're getting these genes passed down through reproduction from parents, right? How is this going to lead to traits, either physiological traits or we'll focus on psychological traits? Um, and you may have learned some of the basics of this based on Mendelian genetics, where you've got um, uh, traits that are dichotomous, different alleles, being then passed down, and you might work it out in a Punnett square, right? Where you see the dominant traits and the um, recessive traits being combined in different combinations in the next generation. Well, backing up just a little bit, this finding was actually really interesting, right? Because people tended to think, yeah, you get things from your parents, but maybe you just get your dad's version, right? Or maybe you just get your mom's version. Or maybe you get a 50-50. You're going to get halfway in between. But it turns out that neither of those are really true. We get the alleles from both contributors. And then it may look like you've only gotten the alleles from one, right? And that's because some traits, some alleles are dominant, and some alleles are recessive, right? So in this case, brown pea pods in this experiment are dominant and white was recessive. And so the next generation would have all brown pea, all brown peas. And so it would look like that they're only getting the brown trait, right? Because the recessive trait over here would only show up if you have both white alleles, right? So, um, what Gregor Mendel, doing some of this research with pea pods, started to question is, well, why don't all seeds end up being brown, right? Well, it's because the white alleles get passed down as well. The recessive traits get passed down as well. So the next generation may receive either the brown trait or the white trait in the second cross. So when I cross this offspring with this offspring, some of them are going to show up uh, with the white pea pods. Right? So this is basic stuff from I don't know, hundreds of years ago. I forget the exact date, right? So the second cross demonstrates that some alleles were present but not expressed. This allows us to think about the difference between what's known as the phenotype and the genotype. Phenotype is what we refer to as observable traits. So in psychology, this is like the behaviors or the personality that we see or the psychological disorders that are present, right? What do we observe in the human behaving or thinking? Okay. And the genotype are going to be the genetic constitution that's passed on. So I might have a genetic constitution coming from two parents, and one of them is very extroverted, and one of them is very introverted. And I may express one version of that, right? But that doesn't mean that I don't have the genetics of the other, right? So my phenotype isn't exactly the same as genotype based on what might be dominant or recessive in terms of what's in my genetic makeup. So I could pass on a recessive trait that I'm not expressing. So the question is, um, how does this work? Does it work like that? Like for extroversion, is there an extroversion allele and an introversion allele? It turns out no. Okay, so it doesn't actually work that way for complex traits. Most human traits are what are known as polygenic, which means, so poly means many, right? Polygenic, more than one gene. So those pea pod color is just one gene with two alleles, basically. So that's the basic Mendelian genetics kind of formula. Okay. Extroversion is not going to be like that. Okay. There's going to be many, many genes that contribute to extroversion. Some human traits do have a roughly Mendelian account where there's one particular gene that's really important for it. But you notice that these are going to be basic biological things, like whether your earwax is wet or dry, whether your earlobes attached to the rest of your head or not, whether your thumb goes back or goes straight up, your blood types, that sort of thing. Question is, any psychological traits? There are some. So there are a couple of disorders, particularly based around mutations, where the copying of the gene doesn't go as you would expect. Maybe there's an extra version of it or a switch in the genetic code. So Huntington's disease, for example, if you get a mutation of a particular gene, you can develop Huntington's disease, which leads to intellectual disabilities, among other things. Um, there's a mutation on a recessive gene. So this is very rare. You have to have the mutation essentially um, twice to have two recessive versions of this on the FOXP2 gene. That seems to be related to an inability to learn language. So this gene seems to be at least critical to language development, perhaps. And then beyond disorders from mutations, there are perceptual differences that are not necessarily a single gene, but might have genes that are very responsible that work in a kind of Mendelian kind of way with a dominant and a recessive version. So color vision deficiency, for example, um, so you might know as color blindness, comes from a recessive trait and other perceptual differences. Scent of asparagus in urine. Some people would smell um, asparagus in urine, and some people can't smell it at all. If you can smell it, you'd be surprised that other people can't. And the taste of certain chemicals. So some of us develop the ability to taste certain chemicals like PTC, and some of us don't. And that seems to be based on some specific genes working in a kind of Mendelian way. Complicated, but mostly individual genes responsible for these things. So just kind of breaking that down, you might be familiar with these kinds of Punnett squares. And I'm not going to test you on these, but this is the kind of thing that we're talking about when we're talking about a gene working in a mostly Mendelian way with dominant or recessive traits to lead to psychological outcomes, right? So most people are going to be able to taste the chemical PTC. Um, okay, so it's a chemical that shows up in some of our foods. Most people can taste it because this is a dominant trait. Okay, that means if I have the gene, I will express it phenotypically. Okay, if I have the dominant gene allele, I will express it phenotypically. Okay, the only way that I'm going to not express the gene or not show it phenotypically. Right? Sorry. The only way I won't show it phenotypically is, and not be able to taste that chemical is if I have both recessive traits. Cool. Okay. So some people are going to have, um, most people are going to be able to taste PTC. Some people will even taste it even stronger than others, because they've got both dominant alleles. But some people won't be able to taste it at all. Okay. And that's going to be because each of their parents, right, are contributing at least one recessive trait. So this individual over here. Just real quickly on PTC, who cares about this, right? This doesn't seem like psychology at all, right? Like, can I taste a chemical? That seems purely biological. But perception is psychological. Whether I taste it or not, whether I have that experience or not, is my psychological experience, right? And it's also related to behaviors, right? So whether I can taste PTC is going to change or affect how I think about different foods. PTC is a pretty bitter chemical. It shows up in coffee, kale, and other things. And so non-tasters taste those foods as less bitter than tasters, right? And super tasters taste them as more bitter, right? And so if you're not a big fan of leafy greens like kale and Brussels sprouts or black coffee, right? Um, it's because you're tasting the PTC as bitter. Okay. And so maybe you put milk in your coffee to reduce the bitterness or something like that. Some people like the bitterness, right? But whether I can taste it at all is based on my genetics. So some people don't taste that bitterness, that particular version of bitterness in coffee at all. There was also global variation in PTC tasting genetics, right? That may be related to food preferences and dietary habits and cuisines of different cultures. So something simple as a genetic variation in whether I can taste a chemical, which is very biological, can lead to societal differences, or at least contribute to ever so slightly to societal differences in things like culinary cuisines.